After creating the emission units, you have to create a unit process as well. We can see each of the unit processes I've already created for this site. First, we'll review the parts of an existing unit process, then we'll go through the steps of creating a new unit process. On this first unit, you can see the emissions unit name and identifier. See the previous video for more information on emission units. Then we have the process identifier. This number here shows how many processes are associated with this unit. Usually this number will just be 1, as there will be an equal number of emission units and unit processes, but depending on how your inventory is best organized, there may be multiple processes for one unit. Some boilers, for example, may take more than one type of fuel, so the boiler would be an emission unit, but we would need 2 unit processes, one for each type of fuel. The next thing here is the SCC, Source Classification Code. This number holds a lot of information. If you hover over it, you can see each of the 4 levels of the description of this SCC. We'll get into more specifics about SCCs later. If we click on this button here, View with the magnifying glass, we can see these tabs up here: Unit Processes, Control Approach, Release Point Apportionment, Additional Information, and Comments. On this Unit Processes tab, we have the Process Identifier, again, the Emission Unit Identifier, the SCC and SCC description, and the last/final emission year. The Control Approach tab includes information about whether this process is controlled, and if so, how it is controlled. The control device here would already have been created in that Control Devices box earlier. For more detail on control devices, watch Part 2, Control Devices of this series. The Release Point Apportionment tab has information about the release point or release points of this process. Most of the time, a process will only have one release point, but sometimes it may have multiple. The release point here would have already been created in an earlier step, and for more information on release points, see Part 1, Release Points of this series. Currently, there is no option to add anything to this additional information tab. This last tab is for comments specific to this unit process. If I go back, then press this Edit button instead of the View button, you can see that I can edit everything about the process except for the emission unit. The main thing I would expect to be edited in a unit process would be this last final emission year box. Here, if a unit process is shut down, you'll enter the last year that it created emissions. For example, if your engine was shut down in November of 2017 but still operated during the rest of that year, you would enter 2017 here, as that was the last year emissions were reported for this process. Now let's go through the process of creating a new unit process. This can definitely get complicated, so we try to keep up with the processes from the agency side, but sometimes all the information we need can't be found in your permit, the permit isn't up to date, or we simply make a mistake. The first step here is selecting the emission unit that corresponds with this process. Again, in most cases, there will be one emission unit for one unit process, but there are some exceptions. If there is more than one process, like an emissions unit uses 2 or more types of fuel, to create the second process, you'll follow the exact same steps to create another unit process. Select the same emissions unit as the first process, and Slice will automatically generate process ID number 2. Once we've selected this emission unit, then we'll select the SCC. There are 2 ways of going about this. The first is by selecting the best verbal match from the drop-down menu. If I click on this first drop-down, I can see the broadest category of SCC descriptors. I'll select Internal Combustion Engine here, then it autofills with the first numerical SCC. I'll need to change these other drop-downs in order to get the correct SCC. Next, we'll say this internal combustion engine is for electric generation, then specify that the fuel is natural gas, then specify that it is a reciprocating rather than turbine engine. Once I've selected each of these drop-downs, I get my final SCC here. Alternatively, if you already know the correct SCC for this process, or have looked it up on the EPA website, you can enter the 8 or 10-digit code directly into this box, then select it when it appears in the drop-down. After entering the SCC, you'll enter a description of this process. Again, Usually this will be the same as the emission unit description, but it may be more specific. In the Control Approach tab, if the process is not controlled, you will check this box and move on to the release point apportion. If the process is controlled, you will not check this box, but enter a control approach description and enter any applicable control devices from this dropdown here. If there is more than one control device or approach on this process, you will press this plus button on the right side. To delete any unnecessary control devices, press this delete button. In the Release Point Apportionment tab, you'll select the release point appropriate to this process, then enter the percentage of emissions going through that release point. In most cases, there will only be one release point for the unit process, so this percentage will be 100. In the case of multiple release points for one process, you'll add additional release points with this plus button, select them from the drop-down list, and enter the percentage of emissions that go through each release point. For example, if a process has two stacks that each release emissions equally, you will have selected 2 release points and entered 50% for each. Your last step will be adding any relevant comments for this specific process, then saving your work. Once a unit process has been created, we can calculate the emissions created by that process in process emissions, which we'll review in the next video.